The warning alarm screamed through the command center as Commander Hyunwoo gripped the metal railing. His knuckles turned white, watching the display screens show one horrifying sight after another. The last defense satellite protecting their homeworld was dying right in front of his eyes. For 3 whole days, it had taken hit after hit from enemy weapons, and now its power was finally running out. The satellite's lights flickered one last time before going completely dark. Hyunwoo felt his heart sink as he realized their final shield was gone. Through the thick glass windows of the orbital station, he could see the black shapes of enemy ships floating in space like deadly sharks waiting to strike. Another massive Vorthak warship suddenly appeared out of nowhere, its dark metal hull reflecting the distant starlight. These ships were built for one purpose only: to destroy everything in their path. The Vorthak had been attacking peaceful worlds for months now, and the Zilani people had no real way to fight back. Communications Officer So Young's hands shook as she read the latest reports coming in from their outer colonies. Her voice cracked with emotion as she spoke. "Sir, we just lost contact with Zilani 7. That makes 12 worlds that have gone completely silent." Hyunwoo closed his eyes and tried to push away the terrible thoughts flooding his mind. 12 entire worlds. Each one had been home to millions of innocent people. Families with children, elderly grandparents, young couples just starting their lives together. Now they were all gone, wiped out by the Vorthak war machine. The Zilani had always been a peaceful race. For over 1,000 years, they had never fought a real war. Their strongest weapons were just mining tools they used to dig for metals and crystals on distant planets. When the attack started, they tried to convert their cargo ships into fighters, but it was like bringing kitchen knives to a gunfight. Hyunwoo opened his eyes and made a decision that would change everything. "Turn on the ancient beacon," he said quietly. The entire bridge went silent. Every person stopped what they were doing and stared at their commander. The ancient beacon was something from the old days, a piece of technology that hadn't been used in 500 years. It was built during the last Great War as a way to call for help when everything seemed hopeless. So Young looked worried as she reminded him of their recent failures. "Sir, the Galactic Council already said no to helping us 3 times. The Altarians told us we're not worth saving because we don't have enough money or resources. The Nexus Collective said we're just acceptable losses in their bigger plans." This made Hyunwoo even more angry. How could civilized species just watch genocide happen and do nothing? How could they put profit and politics above saving innocent lives? He watched as more Vorthak ships joined the attack formation, their weapons charging up for another round of destruction. "Then we look beyond the usual suspects," Hyunwoo said, his voice growing stronger. "Somewhere out there in this huge galaxy, there has to be someone who still thinks mass murder is wrong. Someone who still believes that innocent people deserve to live." The ancient beacon was buried deep in the station's core, surrounded by old technology that most people had forgotten how to use. As the technicians worked to activate it, dust fell from the ceiling with each enemy blast that hit their shields. The beacon's ancient parts started to glow and hum with power as it prepared to send their desperate message across the stars. This wasn't just a call for military help. It was a cry from the heart of a dying civilization. The message would travel through space faster than light, reaching every corner of the galaxy where someone might be listening. It carried with it the voices of billions of Zilani who would never get to see another sunrise, never get to hug their loved ones again. The beacon activated with a deep, powerful sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the station. Its signal shot out into the darkness of space, carrying the oldest and most basic request that any living being could make. "Help us." Captain Minho had been looking forward to this break for months. After spending half a year stuck on cramped spaceships eating recycled food and breathing recycled air, the chance to relax at Terran Station Alpha felt like paradise. He was sitting in the recreation lounge, finally enjoying a real cup of coffee made from actual beans instead of synthetic powder, when his peaceful moment was shattered. The emergency sirens started screaming so loud that everyone in the room jumped. Minho's coffee cup slipped from his hands as every television screen, computer monitor, and wall display suddenly switched to the same emergency broadcast. The cheerful music that had been playing in the background cut off instantly, replaced by the harsh sound of alert tones. A robotic voice echoed through the station's speakers with words that made everyone's blood run cold. All personnel report to stations immediately. This is not a practice drill. We have received a code black distress signal. Minho felt his stomach drop. In all his years serving in the Terran military, he had never heard those words before. Code black was something they only talked about in training exercises and worst-case scenario planning meetings. It meant that somewhere in the galaxy, an entire species was being systematically murdered, and they needed help right now. Admiral Yunji's serious face filled every screen in the room. Her usually neat uniform looked hastily put together, and there were dark circles under her eyes that suggested she had been woken up in the middle of the night. When she spoke, her voice was steady but filled with barely controlled anger. 18 minutes ago, our deep space monitoring stations picked up a distress beacon from a species that calls themselves the Zilani. According to their message, an aggressive empire known as the Vorthak has been systematically destroying their colonies and killing their people. The recreation area, which had been filled with laughter and conversation just moments before, now buzzed with shocked whispers and angry voices. Soldiers, technicians, and officers who had been relaxing after long shifts were now on their feet, their faces showing the same mix of horror and rage that Minho was feeling. Sergeant Tae-hoon, who had been playing cards at a nearby table, slammed, his fist down so hard that the cards scattered across the floor. 18 minutes? We're just hearing about this now after 18 whole minutes? Admiral Yunji seemed to hear the question through the screen as she continued her briefing. The distress signal had to travel through 17 different communication relay stations before it reached our territory. Each relay added precious minutes to the delay, and by the time we received it, entire worlds may have already fallen. Minho felt his jaw muscles tighten as anger built up inside him. The Terran Federation had spent decades trying to earn respect in galactic politics. They had followed every rule, respected every treaty, and played nice with species that often looked down on humans as newcomers to the galactic community. The Galactic Council has already met in emergency session, Admiral Yunji continued, her voice growing harder. They have officially classified the Vorthak attacks as an internal matter between two non-member species. They have voted to refuse any intervention or assistance. The room erupted in angry shouts and curses. Minho couldn't believe what he was hearing. While innocent people were being slaughtered, the galaxy's most powerful governments were hiding behind paperwork and politics. They were treating genocide like it was just another business dispute. This is exactly the kind of bureaucratic nonsense that makes me sick, Tae-hoon growled, crumpling up his playing cards. They sit in their fancy council chambers and debate while people are dying. Admiral Yunji raised her hand for silence, and the room gradually quieted down. All fleet commanders are ordered to converge on Terran command within the next 6 hours. We are going to show this galaxy what happens when decent people ignore cries for help. As Minho jumped up from his chair and started running toward the shuttle bay, his mind was racing. This wasn't just about helping strangers in a distant part of space. This was about what kind of species humanity wanted to be. Would they become like the other galactic powers, cold and calculating, only helping when there was profit involved? Or would they stand up for what was right, even if it meant making enemies? The hallways were filled with running soldiers and blaring alarms as the entire station mobilized for war. Minho knew that everything was about to change, not just for the Zilani, but for humanity's place in the galaxy. Ambassador Jae-min had spent 20 years of his life talking his way out of dangerous situations. He had negotiated peace treaties between warring planets, settled trade disputes that could have sparked wars, and convinced hostile aliens to give diplomacy a chance instead of reaching for their weapons. But as he walked through the cold metal corridors of the Vorthak flagship, he couldn't shake the feeling that this time might be different. The ship itself was built to make visitors feel small and afraid. Everything was made of dark, polished metal that reflected distorted images like a funhouse mirror. The hallways were too wide and too tall, making anyone walking through them feel like an insect. Strange symbols were carved into the walls, probably marking the Vorthak's many victories over weaker species. When Jaemin finally reached the main conference chamber, he had to stop himself from stepping backward. The room was enormous, with a ceiling that disappeared into shadows. Harsh lights created dramatic shadows that seemed to move and shift, making it hard to see clearly. At the far end of the room, on a throne that looked like it was carved from a single piece of black stone, sat Overlord Krexthul. The Vorthak leader was massive, easily twice the size of a human, with thick armor that seemed to be grafted directly onto his skin. 4 glowing eyes stared down at Jaemin with what looked like amusement, as if he was watching an entertaining pet perform tricks. When he spoke, his voice was so deep it seemed to come from the ship's engines rather than his throat. "So the humans have sent us a messenger," Krexthul rumbled, the translation device making his words sound even more menacing. "You offer us trade agreements and mining rights in exchange for creatures we are exterminating like disease-carrying." "Insects," Jaemin took a deep breath and tried to keep his voice steady. This was the moment that could determine the fate of billions of innocent people. "The Zalani are not insects, Overlord. They are thinking, feeling beings with their own families, their own children, their own rich cultures that have existed for thousands of years. Surely there must be a way to solve this conflict without more killing." The sound that came from Krexthul might have been laughter, but it sounded more like metal being torn apart in a crushing machine. "Weakness," he said, leaning back in his throne. "This is exactly why your pathetic species will never understand what real power looks like." "I think there's a difference between understanding power and using it," Jaemin replied, fighting to keep his diplomatic training intact. "Humanity has chosen to use restraint and negotiation instead of violence whenever possible." Krexthul's 4 eyes seemed to light up with interest as he leaned forward. "Chosen restraint? Or do you simply lack the strength to do anything else? Perhaps your species talks about peace because you are too weak to fight real wars." The chamber fell completely silent, except for the low humming of the ship's systems. Jaemin realized with growing horror that he had made a terrible mistake. Not the mistake of coming here to try to negotiate. That had been necessary. His mistake was thinking that these creatures could understand anything other than brute force. They saw kindness as weakness and diplomacy as cowardice. "So your answer is no," Jaemin said quietly. "You won't consider any peaceful solution." Krexthul slowly rose from his throne, his massive form casting an even larger shadow across the chamber. "My answer, little human, is that you and your precious Zalani pets will all join the long list of species that have been erased from this galaxy." Before Jaemin could move or speak, a beam of energy hit him in the chest. The neural disruptor was designed to cause maximum pain while keeping the victim conscious long enough to understand what was happening to them. As his body collapsed and his vision started to fade, Jaemin's final thought was a desperate hope that his death would be recorded and broadcast across the galaxy. He hoped that when his people saw what had happened to their peaceful ambassador, they would finally understand that some enemies could not be reasoned with. Some monsters only understood one language, and it was time for humanity to speak it fluently. The recording of Ambassador Jaemin's execution was indeed broadcast throughout human space within hours. When humanity saw their diplomat murdered, in cold blood while trying to save innocent lives, something fundamental changed in the collective human spirit. The age of restraint was over. The video of Ambassador Jaemin's brutal murder was playing on every screen across human civilization. In the presidential office on Earth, President Sujin sat frozen in her chair, watching the horrible scene unfold for the 7th time. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to grip the armrests to keep them still. Each time she watched their peaceful diplomat get killed in cold blood, the rage inside her grew stronger. The ambassador had gone there with nothing but words and hope, trying to save innocent lives through negotiation. The Vorthak had responded by executing him like he was nothing more than an annoying insect. This wasn't just murder, it was a message to all of humanity that their attempts at peace were seen as weakness. General Dong Hyun stood at attention beside her desk, his military uniform perfectly pressed despite being called in during the middle of the night. His voice was calm and professional, but she could see the anger burning in his eyes. "Ma'am, I've just finished meeting with all the military commanders. Every single one of them agrees. We are now at war with the Vorthak Empire." Defense Minister Ye Jin paced nervously by the window, wringing her hands as she thought about the political consequences. If we attack them, the Galactic Council will condemn us as the aggressors. They'll call us violent and warlike, exactly the reputation we've spent decades trying to change. All our diplomatic progress will be destroyed overnight. President Su Jin stood up slowly, her decision already made. Let them call us whatever they want. Sometimes doing the right thing and doing the legal thing are completely different. I'd rather be called a monster while saving innocent lives than be called peaceful while watching genocide happen. Across human space, something incredible was already happening. Word of the ambassador's death had spread faster than any official government announcement. On every human world, in every space station and colony, people were volunteering to help in ways that amazed even the military planners. Major corporations that usually competed with each other were donating their entire commercial fleets. Mining companies offered their heavy industrial ships to be converted into warships. Passenger cruise liners volunteered to become troop transports. Even small family-owned cargo haulers were showing up at military bases, asking to have weapons installed so they could join the fight. Colony militias that had only existed on paper were suddenly becoming real fighting forces as farmers, miners, and shopkeepers picked up weapons and demanded military training. Retirement communities were full of old veterans coming out of retirement, insisting they still had one more war left in them. On Mars, Admiral Seung Ho walked through the massive industrial complexes that covered half the planet's surface. Just hours ago, these factories had been producing farming equipment, construction tools, and civilian spacecraft. Now, the same assembly lines were being retooled to manufacture ammunition, armor plating, and military-grade weapons. The speed of the transformation was breathtaking. Workers who had been building tractors in the morning were now assembling missile launchers by evening. The engineering teams didn't even stop for meal breaks as they redesigned production schedules and supply chains. "Admiral, how long before we reach full military production?" asked his aide, a young officer whose clipboard was covered with constantly changing numbers. "At this rate, maybe 36 hours for complete mobilization," the Admiral replied, watching sparks fly as welders worked around the clock. "Possibly faster if the outer colonies keep up this incredible pace." Admiral Seung Ho had seen human industry before during peacetime, but this was something entirely different. This wasn't just about manufacturing efficiency or profit margins. This was an entire species united by righteous anger, working together with a single purpose that transcended politics, economics, and personal interests. Every human world was transforming itself into a weapon pointed at the Vorthak Empire. The Galaxy was about to learn why humanity's greatest strength had never been their technology or their individual skill. It was their ability to come together as one people when facing injustice. Deep in space, the first Terran military fleets were already beginning their jump toward Zelani territory. The storm clouds were gathering, and when they finally broke over the Vorthak Empire, the entire galaxy would be reshaped by the thunder that followed. Commander Hyun-woo stared at his sensor displays in complete disbelief. Just 3 days ago, he had activated the ancient beacon with nothing but desperate hope. The Galactic Council had already abandoned them, and every major spacefaring civilization had turned their backs on the Zelani people. He had expected silence, or at best empty promises of help that would never come. Instead, his screens were lighting up with dozens of incoming ships. But these weren't the polished, gleaming vessels he was used to seeing from the galactic powers. These human ships looked like they had been built in a hurry by people who cared more about function than appearance. Their hulls were covered in scorch marks and welding scars, and weapons had been bolted onto every available surface. The communication system crackled to life with heavy static, but the voice that came through was clear and determined. "Zelani, Command. This is Admiral Kyung-soo of the Terran Federation. We received your distress call and we're here to help you." Hyun-woo's voice cracked with emotion as he responded. He had been holding back tears for days, watching his people's civilization slowly die. "Admiral, I have to be honest with you, we're in terrible shape. We're down to our last 3 orbital defense platforms. and the Vorthak have massive siege engines completely surrounding our homeworld. I don't know if there's anything left to save. The human admiral's response was immediate and confident. Not anymore, they don't. What happened next shocked everyone watching. The human fleet didn't ask for battle plans or detailed tactical briefings. They didn't form up in neat, organized formations like every military textbook said they should. Instead, they just attacked. And their approach was completely insane by galactic military standards. The human ships scattered in all directions like a swarm of angry insects. Each vessel seemed to be acting on its own, making split-second decisions without waiting for orders from command. Yet somehow, impossibly, they were all working together in perfect harmony. It was like watching a deadly dance where every dancer knew exactly where their partners would be. Captain Minho's destroyer, called the Harmony, came diving down through the middle of the Vorthak battle formation at incredible speed. But instead of targeting the enemy ship's main hulls where the armor was thickest, his weapons were hitting their sensor arrays and communication dishes. "Blind them first," Minho ordered his crew over the ship's intercom. "If they can't see us clearly, they can't hit us accurately." On the Vorthak flagship, Overlord Krexthul was watching his perfectly organized battle formation fall apart before his eyes. He had used the same proven tactics to conquer 40 different star systems over the past decade. His formations were textbook perfect. His strategies had been tested in hundreds of battles, and his overwhelming firepower had never failed him before. "What in the void are they doing?" he roared at his tactical officers. "This isn't how space combat is supposed to work. Where are their battle lines? Why aren't they following standard engagement protocols?" His tactical officer's voice was filled with panic as he tried to make sense of the chaos on his screens. "Sir, they're using our own destroyed ships as cover, hiding behind the wreckage and then jumping out to attack. One of their ships, called the Vengeance, just deliberately rammed into our heavy cruiser Thunder's Edge, and somehow it's still fighting." Krexthul couldn't understand what he was seeing. These humans weren't just fighting a battle. They were fighting like every single enemy ship had personally insulted their families. There was an emotional intensity to their attacks that made no tactical sense, yet somehow it was working better than any strategy he had ever encountered. "All ships, fall back to secondary formation," he commanded, trying to regain control of the situation. "We need to regroup and establish proper defensive positions." But when his ships began moving to their fallback positions, they found the human vessels already waiting for them there, weapons charged and ready to fire. It was as if the humans could read his mind and predict his every move before he made. The war between humanity and the Vorthak Empire had been going on for 3 brutal weeks, when Lieutenant Colonel Hay-Won got the assignment that would either make her a hero or get her entire team killed. She was sitting in the cramped briefing room of a converted cargo ship when the intelligence officer spread out the holographic displays showing their target. The Kepler 442 system looked like a nightmare on the tactical screens. Human intelligence had discovered that this remote star system housed the main supply depot for the Vorthak's 7th Fleet, their largest and most dangerous battle group. Without this depot, 50,000 enemy warships would be left floating in deep space with no fuel, no ammunition, and no spare parts. Captain Jinwoo whistled low as he studied the defensive readouts. He had been analyzing enemy positions for over a decade, but he had never seen anything quite this heavily fortified. This place is basically an impregnable fortress floating in space. They've got 47 separate defensive platforms arranged in overlapping fields of fire, 3 massive battle stations that could each take on a small fleet by themselves, and at least 200 patrol ships constantly moving around the perimeter. Hay-Won nodded grimly as she absorbed the information. The math was simple, but terrifying. Any conventional attack on this target would require at least 1,000 ships and would probably result in massive casualties. But there was no choice. This depot is the heart of their entire supply network. If we can destroy it, we strand their entire 7th Fleet in the middle of nowhere with no way to refuel or rearm. The plan that Hay-Won's team came up with was so crazy that it made even veteran soldiers shake their heads in disbelief. Instead of trying to fight their way through the depot's massive defenses, they were going to sneak inside by pretending to be space junk. The first part of the plan involved using asteroid mining charges, normally used to break apart space rocks for mineral extraction, to create an artificial debris field near the depot. Then human strike teams would hide inside specially modified ships that were designed to look like battle wreckage from previous fights. Sergeant Tae-hoon raised his hand during the briefing, his face showing the concern that everyone was feeling. "Ma'am, what happens if their sensors detect that our wrecked ships actually have people hiding inside them?" Haewon's smile was grim but confident. "By the time they figure out what we really are, we'll already be inside their defensive perimeter, with our weapons pointed at their vital systems. Sometimes the best way to beat superior technology is to be so unpredictable that they can't plan for what you're going to do." The operation began at dawn and lasted for 8 grueling hours. Human engineers carefully positioned the mining charges to create a debris field that looked natural, but would drift directly toward the depot's docking bays. Strike teams sealed themselves inside ships that had been carefully damaged to look like they had been destroyed in battle. As the fake wreckage slowly drifted closer to the depot, Vorthak sensors detected what appeared to be normal battle debris, the kind of floating junk that was common around any major military installation. The depot's automated systems simply logged the debris and ignored it, exactly as the humans had hoped. When the wreckage finally reached the docking bays, human soldiers emerged from their hiding places like deadly surprises. They moved through the depot with surgical precision, placing explosive charges on fuel tanks, ammunition storage areas, and critical life support systems. When the operation was over, the Kepler 442 system looked like a graveyard. Twisted metal and expanding clouds of gas marked where the depot had once been. 3 months' worth of supplies for the Vorthak's largest fleet had been completely destroyed, leaving 50,000 enemy ships stranded without support. Across the galaxy, military experts from every major civilization were struggling to understand how humans fought wars. Traditional military academies taught orderly battle formations, predictable strategies, and time-tested tactics. But humans seemed to throw all of that out the window in favor of creativity and controlled chaos. The Alterian defense minister gave a report to the Galactic Council that perfectly captured everyone's confusion. "These humans don't follow any known military doctrine that we've ever studied. It's like they're just making up new tactics on the spot." The Nexus Collective's top military advisor nodded in agreement. "That's exactly what they're doing, and somehow it's working better than anything we've seen before. For 300 long years, the Vorthak Empire had controlled half the galaxy through one simple principle: absolute terror. They had built their power on the idea that resistance was impossible, that their technology was unbeatable, and that anyone who opposed them would be crushed without mercy. But fear, as the humans were about to prove, cuts both ways. The news of Overlord Krexthal's death hit the galaxy like a shockwave. The mighty leader, who had seemed untouchable, whose personal flagship was considered the most powerful warship ever built, was gone. Destroyed not by a massive fleet or some superweapon, but by 6 human pilots in small fighter craft who had decided that some things were worth dying for. Commander Hyunwoo could barely believe the intelligence reports as he read them to Admiral Kyung-soo. His voice was filled with awe and disbelief. "The entire galaxy is calling it the miracle at Vega Prime. 6 human fighters somehow managed to destroy a dreadnought that military experts said was completely invincible." Admiral Kyung-soo leaned forward in his chair, fascinated by the tactical implications. How did they manage to do something like that? That ship had armor thicker than most space stations and enough firepower to level entire cities. "They rammed it," Hyunwoo said simply, as if that explained everything. But here's the incredible part. Before they crashed into the ship, they managed to upload a computer virus into its main systems. The dreadnought's own weapons turned against its escort fleet and destroyed half of them before the ship finally exploded. The psychological impact of this single act was more devastating than any military victory. For 3 centuries, the Vorthak had carefully crafted an image of invincibility. They had convinced billions of people across hundreds of worlds that fighting back was hopeless, that their technology was so advanced that resistance would only lead to more suffering. But 6 human pilots had just proven that even gods could bleed. Captain Minho had been instrumental in shattering the myth of Vorthak invincibility. Over the past month, his special strike force had hit 17 different Vorthak command centers, but they weren't just targeting military installations. They were deliberately attacking the symbols of Vorthak authority, the monuments, the propaganda centers, the ceremonial buildings that represented the Empire's power. Each successful attack sent a message across the galaxy. The Vorthak weren't untouchable after all. Communications Officer So Young rushed into the command center with reports that were coming in faster than they could process them. "Sir, we're receiving official surrender requests from 12 different client species. They're all asking to switch sides and join the fight against the Vorthak." This was the domino effect that military strategists had only dreamed about. The Kepler Union, which had provided ships and resources to the Vorthak for decades, suddenly withdrew all their support. The Proxima Confederacy declared complete neutrality, cutting off trade routes that the Empire had depended on for years. Most shocking of all, some Vorthak worlds themselves were beginning to question whether their Empire was worth defending. Reports were coming in of planetary governors refusing orders, of military units laying down their weapons, and of entire star systems declaring independence. The Empire that had seemed unshakable was cracking from within. But the humans weren't. Satisfied with just breaking the Vorthak spirit, they wanted to end the threat permanently. Admiral Xiong Ho's deep strike force was already moving through hyperspace toward the Vorthak homeworld, their ships loaded with weapons that pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable warfare. "The gloves are coming off, Admiral," Xiong Ho told his fleet commanders during their final briefing. His voice was cold and determined, carrying the weight of humanity's absolute commitment to ending this war. "We're not just here to win a few battles or negotiate a treaty. We're here to end the Vorthak Empire permanently, so they can never threaten innocent people again." The weapons his ships carried would have been considered war crimes under normal galactic law. But these weren't normal circumstances. The Vorthak had shown no mercy to the Zilani, no consideration for civilian casualties, and no respect for the basic rules of civilized warfare. Now they would learn what happened when humanity decided that the rules no longer applied. The battle for Vorthak Prime was supposed to be the Empire's moment of ultimate glory. Their military planners had envisioned a heroic last stand that would be remembered for generations, where the superior Vorthak forces would crush the upstart humans and restore order to the galaxy. Instead, what happened was a complete and utter disaster that would mark the end of 3 centuries of tyrannical rule. The humans didn't fight like any enemy the Vorthak had ever faced before. Instead of launching a direct assault on the planet's surface, they approached the battle like surgeons performing a delicate operation. They weren't just trying to win a fight. They were systematically taking apart the entire command structure that held the Empire together. General Dong Hyun stood on the bridge of his command ship, watching the tactical displays with cold satisfaction as the battle unfolded exactly according to plan. The orbital defense platforms that had protected the Vorthak homeworld for thousands of years were being destroyed one by one, their massive structures reduced to twisted chunks of metal floating uselessly in space. "Focus all fire on their communication. Arrays," he ordered his fleet commanders. "I want every satellite, every relay station, and every transmission tower turned into scrap metal. If they can't talk to each other, they can't coordinate their defenses." The strategy was working perfectly. As each communication hub was destroyed, the Vorthak forces became more isolated and confused. Orders couldn't get through, status reports were lost, and panic began to spread through their ranks like a deadly virus. Down on the planet's surface, the Vorthak High Command was experiencing chaos unlike anything in their long history of conquest. The massive war room that had once efficiently coordinated the subjugation of dozens of worlds was now filled with panicking officers and contradictory reports. Urgent messages were flooding in from every corner of their crumbling empire. Entire fleets that had served the Vorthak for decades were suddenly switching sides and joining the human coalition. Planetary governors who had faithfully collected taxes and enforced imperial law were declaring independence and removing Vorthak symbols from their government buildings. But perhaps most terrifying of all were the reports of slave species across the galaxy rising up in armed rebellion. Worlds that had been conquered generations ago were suddenly remembering what freedom felt like. The Vorthak intelligence director, his 4 hands shaking as he read the latest reports, delivered the news that would haunt the Empire's final hours. The humans have given them something we spent centuries trying to crush: hope. The conquered species are calling it the Great Liberation, and it's spreading faster than we can contain it. Supreme Overlord Vex Thul, who had inherited leadership of the Empire after his predecessor's death, couldn't understand how everything was falling apart so quickly. He had been trained from birth to rule through fear and intimidation, but now those tools seemed completely useless. "How is this possible?" he demanded, his voice cracking with desperation. "How can a single species destroy an empire that spans half the galaxy? We have more ships, more weapons, more experience." His chief military advisor, one of the few officers who still remained loyal, gave him an answer that cut to the heart of everything that was happening. "They're not just fighting against us, Supreme Overlord. They're fighting for something bigger than military victory. They're fighting for the idea that no species should have to live in fear of another." The bitter irony of their situation wasn't lost on the Vorthak leadership. They had built their entire civilization on the principle that might makes right, that the strong should rule over the weak, and that power was the only thing that mattered in the universe. Now they were being defeated by a species that fought not for conquest or personal gain, but for justice and the protection of the innocent. As the human fleet finally entered orbit around Vorthak Prime, their weapons trained on the planet's remaining defenses, Admiral Kyung-Soo's voice was broadcast across every communication channel in the galaxy. "This is Admiral Kyung-Soo of the Terran Federation," his words echoed through the cosmos. "The Vorthak Empire's 300-year reign of terror is officially over. Any military personnel or government officials who surrender immediately will be treated fairly according to the established laws of war. Anyone who chooses to continue fighting will be destroyed." Faced with certain annihilation, most of the remaining Vorthak forces chose surrender. 6 months had passed since the mighty Vorthak Empire collapsed under the weight of human determination and galactic rebellion. The galaxy was still adjusting to a new reality, where the rules that had governed interstellar politics for centuries no longer applied. In the grand chamber of the reformed Galactic Council, history was being written with every word spoken. Diplomat Wu Jin stood at the podium, where Ambassador Jaemin should have been standing. The weight of representing humanity in this moment felt enormous, but he carried it with quiet dignity. The chamber was fuller than it had been in decades, packed with representatives from species that had been silent for generations under Vorthak oppression. "The Terran Federation formally requests membership in the Galactic Council," Wu Jin announced, his voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber. "But we don't come here as conquerors seeking to claim territory or demand tribute. We come as protectors of the principles that this body was originally created to uphold." The Altarian representative, whose species had previously dismissed the Zilani as economically non-viable to defend, shifted uncomfortably in his ornate chair. The shame of their earlier inaction was written clearly across his alien features. "For your military methods during the war were quite unconventional by our standards." Wu Jin's response was calm but firm. "Our methods were effective. The Vorthak Empire spent 3 centuries enslaving 47 different species across half the galaxy. It took humanity exactly 6 months to free every single one of them." The Nexus Collective's ambassador, whose people had previously called the Zilani acceptable losses, leaned forward with genuine curiosity. "And what happens now? What are your intentions for the post-war galaxy?" "Now we rebuild," Wu Jin said, simply, but his words carried the weight of absolute commitment. "The Zilani people have already established the first refugee resettlement programs to help displaced populations find new homes. Former Vorthak client species are coming together to form something called the Free Worlds Alliance, a coalition based on mutual cooperation rather than fear." He paused, letting his next words sink in deeply. "And humanity stands ready to defend them all if anyone anywhere tries to repeat the Vorthak Empire's mistakes." Commander Hyun-woo, who had sent out that desperate distress call, what felt like a lifetime ago, now stood as the official Zilani representative to the Council. When he spoke, his voice was filled with gratitude that went beyond mere words. "My people sent out a cry for help when we were facing extinction," he said, addressing the entire assembly. Humanity answered that call. Not because they were legally required to help us, not because there was any profit in saving us, but simply because it was the right thing to do. As the formal debates continued throughout the day, Captain Minho found himself standing on the observation deck, looking out at the stars through the massive windows. The galaxy looked the same as it always had, but he knew that everything fundamental had changed. Admiral Kyung-Soo joined him at the viewport, following his gaze toward the distant stars. "What's on your mind?" he asked quietly. "I keep thinking about something Ambassador Jae-min said during his final diplomatic mission," Minho replied thoughtfully. "He told the Vorthak that understanding power and exercising power are two completely different things. And what do you think about that now?" Minho smiled as he watched a group of mixed-species ships flying in formation outside the station, former enemies now working together as allies. "I think we finally managed to teach the entire galaxy the difference between those two things." Old galactic order had been built on the idea that might makes right, that stronger species could dominate weaker ones, and that military power was the only currency that mattered in interstellar politics. But humanity had proven that there was a different way, a path where strength was used to protect rather than oppress, where power served justice rather than greed. Outside the council chamber, the stars continued to shine on a transformed galaxy. It was a place where distress calls would never again be ignored, where the strong had learned to protect the weak, and where humanity had earned its place at the galactic table, not through conquest or intimidation, but through compassion backed by unwavering moral courage. The storm of war had finally passed, but the legacy it left behind would shape the galaxy for generations to come. In countless star systems, children of dozens of different species would grow up hearing stories about the day humanity came like a storm to answer a cry for help.